I'm sitting here today in the atrium of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, known as FAO. This organization, the first of the UN special agencies, was founded in 1945, even before the end of the Second World War. And it's the largest and biggest of three agencies that deal with food here in Rome. That's the reason I'm here. The three agencies have slightly different responsibilities. FAO tends to deal more with production and big commodities. It also has a mission to end hunger everywhere in the world. And it's home to an office that does important work on the right to food. The second agency that's here, founded in the 1960s, is the World Food Programme. And that was founded to deal with emergencies and crisis arising from poor weather, but also war and conflict, primarily a humanitarian space. And the third agency was founded in the food price crisis that occurred in the early 1970s. And that, the International Fund for Agriculture and Development, or IFAD, is, as it sounds like, a financing mechanism that invests in all of rural development, not just in the production of food, but its processing and its distribution through a value chain. Those three agencies come together in a space called the UN Committee on World Food Security. This week is the 51st session of that committee, known in shorthand as the CFS. And the CFS has a very interesting space in the multilateral system. Founded in the 70s and relatively quiet and neglected, it was brought back to life in 2009 in the wake of one of the most serious food price crises of our time. Very high spiking prices and poor harvests, especially for rice, caused a lot of knock-on effects in the food system and put many more people into either precarious or outright hunger, precarious positions or outright hunger. And so the Committee on Food Security became a place with the work of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, with the work of a big group of different civil society organizations and especially social movements of pastoralists and small-scale farmers and fisherfolk, farm workers, women's organizations as well. It became a space where the UN was going to look in a consistent and consolidated way at what food policy needed, and it was going to do so with the assistance of civil society, also philanthropy, the private sector. And it created a quite unique structure for multilateralism in which the members would have the decision-making power ultimately, but they would also have participants and create a space in the decision-making to hear from civil society, social movements, and the private sector. This year, the CFS is dealing with two big issues. One is data, which of course links to digitalization and links to some of the biggest challenges facing us in the century. And it started as a fairly small project, I think, in people's minds, where it was about, collecting data and what do we know. But of course, data is not simple. And it turned into really an important conversation on who decides what we count, how do we decide it, who has access, who owns the data when it's collected. And although it's still quite tentative, the agreement now has a positioning for governance and deciding how that data is going to be used. The agenda this week also includes a framework on gender empowerment and food security and nutrition. And it's no surprise to anyone that it's very important to center women in food systems if you want to see the realization of the right to food. But it remains a big, big struggle with many national governments to recognize women's rights and to recognize what empowerment encompasses. But we have an important framework now that's been agreed and will be one of the documents going forward that civil society will be able to make use of. Why does an organization like IATP come here? We come because it is a place where we have a voice and we respect that. It's a place where we come to learn from all of our friends and allies. It's really a rare occasion to meet with so many social movements with representatives from every part of the world. The coordinating committee of the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism, which is what the conduit and the organizing place for those of us engaged in the policy from a public interest point of view, that has constituency representation from all of the groups that I mentioned. It also has regional representation. So IATP, for example, we're part of the North America discussion for the civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism as well. And so we're able to use this space as a way to organize in our regions as well, and then to bring our regional experience and understanding into a global conversation, and to bring that to the attention of governments, other UN agencies, and other actors in the world of food security and nutrition. I think as a final point, there's different rival events. There've been a number of UN summits on food security. To answer a question on why we think this piece of the UN with a slightly cumbersome name is so important, it is that it creates legally binding outcomes. And there's a tendency for multi-stakeholder places to organize more around a kind of show and tell, bring us an initiative you have, share information about it, invite people to come and learn from you, something that's really important to do, of course. But those spaces like the UN Food System Summit have no legal mandate and therefore no possibility of a legally binding outcome. And so for those of us trying to get public policy reform, to get governments to be held accountable to commitments they've made, to get new and better commitments for ensuring the realization of the right to food and the end of hunger, it doesn't really advance us all that much to be part of that kind of expose. And we're much more interested in engaging where we can actually have a meaningful conversation about who's going to do what and what will happen if they don't, and how do we remind you and maintain the pressure on you to implement the commitments that you have. So if you look at the CFS website, you'll see a fine array of documents that can be used as legally binding commitments.